Hi, everybody. Welcome again to part 5 to the series. It's good to see all of you. And I so appreciate that you've made the commitment to return week after week. What a full and tremendous time we've been spending together. So much to think about and reflect on, and I hope you're finding opportunities to write about all that you've been learning as well, and perhaps even engaging in conversations and questions with others. This is definitely a semester's worth of work crammed into these 5 weeks. Next week, our last event, you will have a chance to ask questions of us and the faculty of the school, and for us to ask questions of you as well. So I'll send out some questions for you to reflect on in the next e-blast for next week. So thanks again for coming. Our first presenter is Patricia St. Onge. Elder St. Onge is a member of the Haudenosaunee and Quebecoise communities, and she was adopted into the Cheyenne River Lakota community. She is our resident elder at Mills College, where I teach in Oakland, California, and she's also a professor of ethnic studies. She's the founder of 7 Generations Consulting and Coaching, working primarily with social justice organizations. And she's a lead author of Embracing Cultural Competency, a roadmap for nonprofit capacity builders. She serves on the board of directors of the Highlander Research and Education Center in Tennessee, is a member of 1,000 Grandmothers for Future Generations, and is a signatory on the Indigenous Women of the Americas Defending Mother Earth Treaty. Elder St. Onge, welcome to the Barbara Brennan School of Healing.
Nyawangoa, thank you. Sego Aguego, Patricia Tanomi Kochpeshni Ichiwi Jungiats. Hello, everybody. My name's Patricia, as Patricia said. I am delighted to be here, and part of the, so my identity has grown, shifted in some ways. I'm French Canadian and Haudenosaunee, or so Haudenosaunee is a confederacy of 6 nations, and my relatives, two of my grandparents were from Kahnawake, which is a Mohawk community in Quebec. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am on Ohlone territory here in Oakland, California. And I would invite you to think, I know that you're not all from the Bay, so I would invite you to consider the land that you're sitting on and whose land it was before colonization. Overwhelmingly, what's now the United States was never ceded to the colonizers, and so it's stolen land. And so we want to acknowledge that as we begin our conversation today. So I invite you to take a second to think about whose land you're on and to send them love and gratitude. Thank you. So I know I'm coming into a series, and so I hope that it doesn't feel disjointed, or I hope that you're able to make the connections. And so I thought in order to help do that, it might be useful to talk about indigeneity for a minute. John Trudell, who was a local artist, a Lakota artist and activist, said at one time, "We're all indigenous to somewhere." And so as we think about that as a frame, indigeneity is a root identity that everybody shares, and the ways that cultures have shifted what it means to be indigenous has had very, very different consequences. And so in a way, I think that the European and European American experience, at least in some part, has to do with a lack of memory or a loss of memory. So because everybody was indigenous at some point to somewhere, there are certain values that indigeneity fosters and encourages. And when we lose those, it's easier to become predatory or to become a colonizer around the world. And so I want us to start from that place, that all of us are indigenous to somewhere. And so what we suffer from when we don't, when we're out of touch with that, is really a loss of memory, and not necessarily being bad people or anything like that. So I think what I'll do is start with talking a little bit about the principles of indigeneity, and then look at how that was interrupted by by Catholicism and expansion, kind of a geographic expansion, and what the consequences look like now, and a little bit about resilience, and then we'll open it up. So that's kind of the arc of where I'd like us to go today. And so as we think about indigeneity as an idea and a way of life, rather than as a people, some of the principles of indigeneity are that we are the land from which we emerge. So indigenous people of the Americas don't necessarily, we may use the language of caretaker or stewards of the land, but in the deepest sense, we are the land. The ancestors are in the land, they've become the trees so it is our identity as much as it is a relationship. And so what that means is that we are part of the ecosystem. So when we see ourselves as caretaking or stewarding, we separate ourselves from our root identity as the land itself. And what, as we think about indigeneity, the principles of indigeneity, the three pieces that make sense for me are, I like alliteration, so land, language, and legacy. So when we are rooted in the land of our origins, we have a different relationship with that land. And so I know, for example, when we moved to California, one of the elders reminded me to bring soil from my homeland and to put it here as a way of bridging my transformation to being a Bay Area person. And also language. You know, if you want to colonize a people, the first thing you do is take away their language. And so when you think about the process of enslavement, one of the things that happened as people were being brought from Africa is that they were placed in ships in strategic ways so that they wouldn't be able to talk with people who shared their language, because language is like a glue that holds a culture or community together. So land and language, and then the third is legacy. And the legacy is both the stories and the ancestors, a kind of awareness of where we come from. It's also our children and the future generations. So, you know, my consulting practice is called 7 Generations Consulting and Coaching, because I want to remember all the time that I stand on the shoulders of the generations who came before me, and that everything that I do will have an impact for at least 7 generations. So when you think about, you know, in the United States, for example, the way that the posture that people held when they arrived here has had an impact for 7 generations. My kids are the 7th generation from emancipation, and they are mixed African American, Native American, and French Canadian. And so they're living with the consequences of the 7 generations since emancipation, and the 10 or 12 generations from the landing in Quebec. So so we're not isolated. I think one of the heartbreaks of colonization is the legacy of separation, where we have come to see ourselves as separate from each other and separate from the land, separate from the generations before, and in many ways even separate from the generations to come. And separation from each other. Can you imagine if we all understood how profoundly connected we are to each other? Our public policy would be different, our economic systems would be different, everything would be different, because we, the way they're set up rooted in the notion that we are separate from each other, and that there are only some people who, and some other relatives, some non-human relatives, some matter and some don't. And so living through a lens of indigeneity is about living through a deep understanding of relationship. And that has to do with all of our relatives, not just the human relatives. So I would like, so Russell, if you could show the, Randall, I'm sorry, if you could show the printout. So I find this a helpful metaphor, how culture is like an iceberg, because when you think of the word culture, what comes to mind initially? It's often the things above the surface, like food, dress, music, art, literature, celebrations, language. Those are often what we think of when we think of culture. But if we look at what we call deep culture, there's a whole bunch of other things there, like patterns of superior and subordinate relations, nature of friendship, arrangement of physical space, facial expressions, definition of insanity, ordering of time. So, you know, the sense of urgency often is culture bound. And that's why you find, I found, you know, people talking about CP time or Indian time, or in Hawaii, it's island time. It's because time, as it's structured, really is subjective. But when you have a dominant culture, whatever is their particular norm becomes the norm. Okay, so you could take that down for now. Thanks. So as I talk a little bit about Indigenous culture, a little bit of history, and then what's going on now and why it's important to understand indigeneity. Indigenous culture is it's the stuff above the surface. So it's, you know, the ceremonies and the regalia and the powwows and all of that is all part of Indigenous culture. Underneath, it's also understanding of friendship, for example, like what does it mean? Or understanding of war and enemy. So Indigenous culture has a very different understanding of enemy than Western culture does. And so that's why you have stories of people, including after conflict, people adopt other people as part of the cultural practice. And now that adoption process has opened up and is broader. And so I was incredibly honored to be adopted into the Cheyenne River Lakota tribe. And that honor was granted to people who were captives during disputes. So everything below the surface of the iceberg, which I'm happy to, I don't know if we can make sure that everybody gets a copy of the iceberg, just because it's, for me, a really interesting and helpful metaphor. Okay. So white supremacy culture has its own iceberg. And if we were face to face, I would say, what are some of the things that are above the surface of white supremacy culture? I don't know how to manage that on Zoom. Can we do a call and just have people, if you have any thoughts, what are the elements of white supremacy culture that are above the surface?
People can just unmute and share if they like.
Cleanliness is next to godliness.
Okay.
Light
Great.
colored skin, light colored hair is beautiful.
A sense of entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
KKK.
I didn't hear that.
We own the land.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The KKK and Nazis, he was very visible to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the extreme expressions of white supremacy culture.
Might makes right.
Might makes right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hierarchical political structures.
Yep.
Accumulation of wealth.
Focus on the individual rather than the group.
Yep.
Capitalism and materialism.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Identity is strongly connected to work.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Youthfulness is prized, being older isn't. Beauty standards for women, you know, blonde hair, blue eyes, thin.
Yep. Great. So those are some clear elements. If you were to, and sometimes I do this when I'm in person with a class, I give them a big sheet of paper with a blank iceberg and have them, you know, in groups of similar background, fill in the iceberg. Or for the institutions sometimes, which is also very interesting. Like we could do one for Mills College or for the Brennan Institute. Is that what, is that where we are today? And see what's below the surface and what's above the surface for the, because when people come together, they create a culture. And so, yeah, there's so many elements of culture, and overwhelmingly we just live into them unconsciously. It's just what is. And so, so maybe if you do homework for this group, you could take an iceberg and look at either the ethnic or racial community that you're part of, or the organizational community, or even your extended family, and use the iceberg as, I did this work with a big spiritual community, and the co-leaders spent 3 or 4 evenings just going through and looking at this iceberg and filling in their own. And then it became the work of the organization to be intentional about identifying culture, because most of the elements of culture we absorb growing up without thinking about it. And so they don't seem like external things. They seem like this is normal behavior. This is a normal way of understanding the world. And so by bringing some deliberate intention to it, we can look at which are the ones that are life-giving and which are the ones that are that lead to separation and isolation, or worse, to disruption of other cultures and other communities. So I wanted to tell a couple of stories, if that's okay. One about how Indigenous culture is experienced by Native people. And one of them, I was working with the American Indian Child Resource Center, which is a after-school program and summer program for high school students mostly. And so the first time I met with them, I said, what's your experience in the world? If you could say a word or two about how you fit, you know, what your experience of being in the Oakland schools, for example, or in the community. And overwhelmingly, I was so surprised that what they had written and then shared with each other overwhelmingly was invisible. And as I thought about that, I realized that because most people think that all Indian people are dead, that's less true since Standing Rock, but certainly when I was growing up, and if you listen to public discourse, we're often talked about in the past tense. So what is Native culture? It's a historic thing. It's not a current thing. And, you know, it's not unreasonable because when estimates are that there were 20 million people here when the Europeans first came, and by mid 19th century, there were less than 250,000. So the fact that most people think we're dead is not totally out of, it's not unreasonable. And we are, many of us, mixed race, and we are reclaiming an identity and a culture. But for example, it was illegal to have any kind of ceremony until 1978. So in 1978, during the Carter administration, Congress passed the American Indian Child Welfare Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, both of which were the first time in over 100 years that our existence and our culture had been legalized by the US government. So, so this is, for us, one of the consequences of white supremacy is that for over a century, we didn't even get to legally be recognized. And even now, there's a lot of, every tribe has had to become recognized by the federal government using a particular set of standards that are totally awash in Western culture. So it had to do with numbers of people and being able to trace. So all of the records of births were destroyed, and then in order to be recognized, you had to be able to trace a lineage back to somebody. So it's a catch-22. So the Ohlone people, on whose land I'm sitting, are not federally recognized because when the settlers came during the gold rush and before the gold rush, they put bounties out for native scalps, and it was like 25 cents for a man and 15 cents for a woman and a nickel for a child. And so settlers collected those bounties, and by 1906 there were 14 Ohlone people compared to the hundreds. I can't remember now if I said. Anyway, so the whole community was decimated, and many people went underground and became Mexican in order to survive. And they now are in a situation where they can't be federally recognized because they don't have the data to prove that they're Indian. So it's it's part of the way that the US government has dealt with Native people historically. And so in 1978, the Religious Freedom Act was passed by Congress, and that means that we now legally can have ceremony. And, my firstborn was born in 1978. So it's not that long ago when you think about the span of time. And now they're finding artifacts that are showing that people have been here 30, 40,000 years. And so to have that disrupted in such a significant way, and then just only recently been sanctioned by the US government, really, for me, helps to contextualize our situation as Indigenous people. So I want to talk a little bit about structures, what happened and then what structures were put in place for assimilation, and what the liberating process has been like. Wow, it's already, sorry. So the three things I'll point to are the land theft. The land theft was done initially by murder, and then by so there's a dilemma, you say, so the idea was, well, let's Christianize them, let's have them assimilate. And so off the coast of Massachusetts, there's an island called Deer Island. So some native people in Massachusetts became Christians. And then the Christians were like, ooh, that's not quite what we wanted. And so their remedy was to put them out, they called them the Praying Indians, and they put them out on Deer Island in the winter with no food and no shelter. And some of them wrote while they were on the island, so we have records, we have their diaries, so we know what happened. But essentially they all died except for 2. And so this, to me, is a perfect illustration of the tension that's always existed between Indigenous people and colonists, and that is that we want them to be more like us, but if they get to be too much like us, that makes us uncomfortable, so we have to get rid of them. And so that's, in a sentence, my sense of the relationship between Indigenous people and colonizers. And the second frame, so that's land theft. The second is the Trail of Tears. And that was called the Removal Act. And as you know, or you may know, Andrew Jackson was the president who had been the Secretary of the Army, who choreographed that whole process. It was a way of eliminating Indigenous people and getting their land and having the right people owning the land. And so the Trail of Tears was intentionally designed to kill people. It was called Relocation, but in fact, more people died along the way than got there by a good number. And then the third was Relocation, which happened after World War II. People came back from the war, the suburbs were growing, and they wanted more land, and white people in particular wanted a lot more land. And so the federal government went on the reservations and told people, you can have, if you move to these 8 cities around the US, there's housing and jobs waiting for you. And so they got on buses and they came, and this was a lot of my parents' generation. And Oakland was one of those relocation sites. And when they got off the bus, there was nothing. There was nobody waiting for them. There was nothing. And so here and in Denver and a couple other places around the country, in fact, in Oakland, it was the Quakers who helped them form Intertribal Friendship House. And that was and supported it for a long time so that they could actually relocate here in a way, because they got one-way tickets on the bus, so they couldn't even go back home. People were really stuck here. So those different forms reflect the times in which they happened. In the early 50s, they couldn't very well just shoot them all, so they relocated them instead. But throughout all of that, there were, the boarding schools started as another way of structuring assimilation. So over the door of Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, it said, kill the Indian to save the child. That was the school's motto. And so everything that they did was designed to kill the culture of the students who came there. So they cut their hair and dressed them and in Western clothes and didn't allow them to speak their languages. And one of the things that struck me, I hadn't, you know, when you know two pieces of information and then they come together and it's like, oh my. So when someone close to us dies, we cut our hair. So when my mom died last year, I cut my hair. So all these little kids come into the boarding school. They've been kidnapped from their families. The first thing they do is delouse them and cut their hair. So all these children are sitting in this foreign place wearing clothes that they can't relate to, seeing no faces other than each other that they understand and no language they speak. And then they believe that their mothers have died. And so the heartbreak of that experience of boarding school, just for me, the cutting the hair to making that connection made it sink into real depth about what was happening for those young people. And they were, some of them as young as 4, right through to teenagers. So we have, as a legacy, the United States has prioritized white lives, white families, and white culture. But instead of calling it that, recognizing it for that, it became right. These are the right ways to do family, the right way to dress, the right way to live, and the right way to be in relationship to the land. And it eliminated the possibility of inclusion of anybody else, unless they could somehow become culturally white, which is what happened in a lot of cases. So I don't want to, so I want to say 2 more things. One is how this relates to where we are now. So when you think about COVID-19, the impact on people both on the reservations, I'm guessing you've heard about what's happening in the Navajo Nation. It's happening in other reservations as well. The mortality rate is significant. It's also happening in urban Indigenous communities. The proportionality is completely out of whack. We've heard some in the news about the disproportionate impacts on Black communities, and it's horrific. It's rates of incarceration, rates of deaths by COVID, all of those things are parallel in the Native community, but it doesn't get any coverage because the primary sense of who we are is still invisible or dead. And so we're not hearing very much about the statistics for Native people, but they're pretty horrific. And, you know, I certainly don't want to think about this as oppression Olympics. And people are dying in pretty significant numbers. The other thing that makes Indigenous situation singular, the one thing, is the issue of jurisdiction. So the reservations are in trust. So the federal government still owns that land. The federal government runs it's federal government jurisdiction. They're situated within states who have no jurisdiction. So there's all this conflict, but the tribes don't own the land. The federal government owns the land, and the tribes are wards of the federal government. And so when crime happens on the reservation, the tribes have tribal government, but the federal government can overturn that. So it's a token authority. And as a result, there are countless missing and murdered women, Indigenous women, and the states. So people can come on the reservation, the sheriff can't come after them, they can't, there's no redress for the community, and the states don't recognize tribal governments, and in some cases the federal government doesn't recognize. So even on the reservations, people can't fully govern themselves because they're still technically wards of the federal government. So we've been infantilized and just never seen as fully human, even to this day. And there's an incredible level of resilience and resistance, and that has, so for example, during all the time that ceremony was illegal, there was ceremony happening underground, and now it's up and people are in ceremony a lot. That has a lot to do with the American Indian movement and the work that was done by our elders to develop some sense of self-determination. It's an unfinished work. And Standing Rock is another example of incredible resistance and resilience when people came together, and many, many tribes were there. And in homes, everywhere that we are, we're reclaiming our identity and our practices and our culture. And we're finding that many of our relatives are in a position to support and acknowledge. And that was one of the powerful things about Standing Rock, is all the people who came who were not Native, who came with good hearts and really with a willingness to support the leadership of the Indigenous people. There's a group called Idle No More that was started, that's also doing active work. And then urban Indian communities are really cultivating and developing a sense of intertribal identity, because now we're in the second and third and fourth generations of people who didn't grow up on the reservation. And so what that looks like for us. So there's for me, there feels like a resurgence and a lot of hope, because people, both Native and non-Native, are recognizing that the story isn't well understood. And so people, you know, like I'm excited, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has written a book called Native People or Indigenous People's History. So it's the same title, you know, the People's History of the United States. Hers is the Native or Indigenous People, Indigenous, I think, People's History of the United States. I strongly recommend. She's done a really good job of laying out the history through the lens of the Indigenous communities. So with that, I'll open it up and see if people have questions or comments or thoughts that you want to share. I guess you'll have to unmute yourself to speak.
We're asking that people raise their hands electronically to queue up for questions, and then I'll call on them.
Oh, great.
I put the directions in the chat on how to do that. You go to the participants button and scroll all the way down. There'll be a blue button that says raise your hand.
We only have 5 minutes.
Oh, I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
That's
No,
okay.
I'm
That's
sorry I
okay.
went on.
No, that was great. Thank you.
So go ahead, Blanche.
You're muted, Blanche.
There you are.
Okay. Hi, Patricia. My name is Blanche, and I live in Canada on Dene land, mainly the Clicho Nation. And so they have self-government and they own the land. I just wanted to comment on something you said, which is about intertribal relationships happening with so much hope. And one of the recent things that's happened, which you may be aware of, is the Dene here, the Clicho, are related to the Navajo in the United States. And just recently, about a few months ago, they all met for the first time in generations.
That's very exciting.
Yeah, it's hugely exciting, and people came back really energized at having made those connections. There was just lots of ceremony.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Jerry, if you'd like to ask your question, we can unmute you.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm over here in Hawaii, and my question has to do with cultural appropriation. And do you see it being appropriate anyway, or being useful in any way? Thank you.
That's a really good question. I think I don't feel like I can be the police of culture, but I do find that often when people take on somebody else's culture, they don't release their own. And so the process is very Western. And it often ends up with white people getting paid for things that Native people do because we don't feel like it's appropriate. We don't believe it's appropriate to get hired to do ceremony, for example. And so most of the people who are making money leading ceremonies are white people, in my experience and observation. So I don't think that it's in itself a bad, I don't feel like I can pass judgment on whether appropriation is, but my experience is that most appropriation is misappropriation.
Yes, thank you. And like, how about using phrases like the word aho in our culture? Is that the real issue we have, or is that a symptom of the issue, or you know, aloha and mahalo that white people use here in Hawaii continuously?
Well, that's a good, what do you think? Because it's happening there too.
Yeah, I'm with you on this, absolutely, that cultural misappropriation is the thing we have to be aware of. And so when people, for instance, getting paid for ceremony, or using some sacred ceremony in a non-sacred way, things like that, I think, are really misappropriation. Words like aho that come into our general speaking, I think, actually help realize that there is another culture that's important to recognize and had important traditions and ways of being, sitting in circle and honoring other people. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think it's important that we recognize the whole story, you know, not just that it cost people their lives for us to be able to say aho.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think that's what gets lost in the translation. It's like it's a chic thing to do, or a hip thing to do, or a I'm so culturally relevant kind of thing to do. without the understanding. Like I went into a shop and a white woman was selling dream catchers. And I said, do you share the profits from this with any tribal people? And she was insulted by my question. So, you know, it's not the fact of I have been in ceremony, or I would say that leading ceremony is really inappropriate. Participating in ceremony, if you're invited by a Native person, is very different in my mind.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. And Patricia, thank you so much for being with us at the Barbara Brennan School. Really appreciate your commentary, your presentation, and thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I
Yeah.
appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll see
And
you,
so
I'll see you in a few weeks.
Yeah, in Mohawk, we say Nyawangoa means big thank you. And your welcome is just yo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, is it okay for me to just stay on and listen to the next speaker?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Kai, could you help us to just catch our breath?
Sure.
And before we move on to our next speaker.
So thank you very much, Patricia St. Onge, for your wisdom and taking the time to be with our community and share your wisdom. Very much appreciated. And so as we take this minute between speakers, I want you to really let the words that have been shared, the teaching that have been shared, to move through your body. So actively create, if it feels right for you, just some movement through your body. Use your breath to ground. And really take all of the teachings that resonate for you deep into the cells of your body. Inviting your body to connect to the lands that you come from, and to feel with deep appreciation the land that you may be sitting upon that was stolen. And feel these two places on the earth moving through you. Breath, movement. Stretch the toes. And just take one more moment to see what your next piece is. Notice what Spirit guides you to do with this information, with this teaching today. And to give thanks and acknowledgement to the grandmothers and grandfathers of the land upon which we sit. And then open a space for our next speaker, a gentle open space to receive what is here for you. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Kai. Our next presenter is Stacey K. Haynes, and Stacey Haynes is the founder of Generative Somatics, a multiracial social justice organization that trains social and environmental justice leaders, organizations, and alliances. She's a national leader in the field of somatics, specializing in healing individual and systemic trauma. She's a senior teacher at the Strozzi Institute and a master somatic coach. Her books include The Politics of Trauma, Somatics, Healing, and Social Justice, and Healing Sex, a mind-body approach to healing sexual trauma. Stacey Haynes, welcome to the Brennan School of Healing.
Very happy to be with you all. Thanks for having me. And I just got the end of Patricia's talk. Thank you also very much for what you brought. Cool. Do you want me to just dive in, or where do we want to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. I was also going to do just a little movement and practice. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about somatics to start, and then we can practice together. I know you all are sitting and listening and being and learning together, but I also know it might be a lot of sitting. So the main thing I want to explore with you all today and bring into this conversation that Patricia has been organizing for you all is to really look at this deep intersection between personal and systemic or social change. Why is it in many ways that we need to intersect these? And what is the cost, or really the limitation when we don't? I've really found, I've been working in healing and social change work for the last 25 years, going on 30 years. And I really see that, developing our art and our skill to do healing work and transformative work with people is a different set of skills. They're complementary, but it's a different set of skills than the skills it takes to really do social movement building, mass mobilization, policy change, right? They're different skill bases. But many of you might be familiar with there's been really a very, very rich experiment over the last decade plus in the United States of reintegrating personal and social transformation, really addressing both personal and systemic trauma and the root causes in a new way. This has happened many times in the history of the United States, and of course, many times in a wide variety of cultures and contexts around the world, but we're kind of in our generation's experiment of it. So that's what I'm going to talk about and explore today. I do really invite your all's questions throughout. I'll probably pause a number of times and just go, what are you thinking? How's this landing? As we go through our time. I won't just wait until the end for questions, so feel free to raise hands, throw them in, whatever your practice is here. I want to put up, am I able to share my screen? Ooh, I am, exciting. I'm going to share an image with you all for a moment. I want to share this image because for me, it's one of the images that helps us to understand why being aware of the social context, the economic context that we're in, is so relevant to healing. So this particular image, somatics is a little bit different than what you all train at your school, but complementary. Inside of somatics, of course, we're looking at how do we embody transformation? How do we be deeply connected to what we most care about in our visions, and then be able to act from that even when we're under pressure. One of the definitions of transformation from a somatic point of view, of personal transformation from a somatic point of view, is just that we've transformed when our ways of being, our ways of relating, our ways of taking action are aligned with our visions and our values, even under pressure, right? Because it is under pressure that we tend to react, or we tend to kind of respond from older habits that we learned often much earlier in our lives. Yeah. So what we talk about is somatic awareness, really building our awareness of sensation, aliveness, and energy. Somatic practices, taking on purposeful practices that align with who we want to be, how we want to act, what we want to build in the world. And then somatic opening, which is really letting the old habits get to transform out of the body, the soma, the thinking, into more resource patterns. So why I have this image up is that much of what we do inside of healing and much of what's embodied in us, of what we're working and struggling with, is actually shaped by the social context. And what I mean by that is it's shaped by the kind of social norms and the rules that we live inside of. It's shaped by the economy and how we're asked to operate inside of racial capitalism, right? The rules of the economy. It's shaped by how we are in relationship with land or not in relationship with land, and how that's been trained into us. But this broader kind of background of the social conditions or the social context are always with us, both in what we've internalized as practitioners or healers, and in what other people have embodied or internalized and then are coming to you to work with. It's funny in some ways. I think it's just primarily out of a more individualized training or more Western training that we think that the individual can actually be separated out of the social context and the cultural practices that we live in. You know, that comes out of a Western history of thinking and a separation of mind, body, a separation of human and the earth. The last thing I want to point to on here is that also bigger than the social context is landscape and spirit. And I want to invite you all to use whatever term works for you for landscape and spirit. I'm just going to stop my share. But things broader than human also shape us. I'm sure many of you have read a lot of the research into resilience and what brings people resilience. Land, landscape, nature, wilderness, animals is a huge aspect of resilience for human beings. And then our connection to source, spirit, mystery, what's more vast, also has a very profound impact on us. So those components of what's beyond human are also part of what we really look at in the framework, right? The broader framework of healing. So I just wanted to give that as a bit of an overview to help us dive into, I think, two questions. How is it that social norms and social systems that are based in domination, right, or what we call power over, how do those things get deeply internalized in us, even when we don't believe in them, right? The first question. The second is really, how do we as healers or practitioners, how do we deeply intersect that understanding so that we can actually have a more profound impact in the work that we're doing and also make broader change in the world, okay? Let me just pause for a moment and let me ask you all, are there key questions or quandaries that you've been in around this intersection between personal and social transformation?
Stacey, I don't have a question about that, but could you repeat the second question you just shared?
Yeah, how do we as healers really integrate a deep understanding of social conditions and oppression into our work? Really in the big picture, personal transformation and collective social action, I don't think there should be any separation between them. And it's very interesting to me that what we've inherited is a separation between those things, right? Individual transformation, collective transformation, they're so co-serving. Yeah. All right.
Julie, would you like to share? Julie had her hand up.
Oops, Julie, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you so much. What I've been aware of, particularly in the last like 10 years, but much more intensively since the election in this country in 2016, is that somehow my own personal journey has unfolded in a way that has changed my consciousness of being a good little white girl brought up in a combination New England Protestant, Roman Catholic cultural setting, which was very limited. And then expanding, and being exposed to and entering into other experiences that have changed my personal consciousness completely.
Mm-hmm.
And that has kept growing and growing. And the Barbara Brennan School was a huge part of that growth, as we had students when I was there from 48 nations. So here I am, 2016, with this, having grown through the 60s, the civil rights, anti-war movement, and now, how do I contain and discern and moderate the energy in me that feels like it is bumping up against titanic walls that are not only saying, no, we will not change societally, but if you move against it, we'll kill you. I mean, that's what I see happening. And I am engaged in this deeply myself, but I feel like I want to give voice to what I perceive to be the moment we're living in this country.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. You said many things inside of that. I want to speak to you for a moment, kind of based on what Julie said, that personal transformation, and Julie, how you talked about your expansion and how much you transformed. Personal transformation is a really essential part of how we in some ways prepare ourselves to be like more skilled and compassionate actors inside of social transformation. And personal transformation itself does not create social change. And this is something that feels very important for us to grapple with. Even if everyone did their work, if everyone engaged in their personal transformation, it would still not create change in the economy and in the social norms at the scale that we need it. Right parallel to that is systemic transformation. What we mean by that is that we're changing the rules of the society and the economy. Yeah. So instead of saying, really in the US context, but also in the global context, that white supremacy are the rules by which things are organized, right? It's the rules by which resources get organized, by which worth and dignity get organized, by which safety gets organized, right? And that is supported through many, many institutions. I'm going to show you another slide in a minute. But to change those broader structures, to change a legacy and history of white supremacy, we have to change many things structurally. Yeah, that means policies. That means actually how our economy works. Yeah, so this sometimes can be a tension in between. We need the personal change to expand ourselves, to build our tolerance for aliveness and connection with others, to deepen our compassion, right? To heal our traumas. All those are so essential as we awaken more as people and get more connected. And bringing all of that into collective action for social change, right? So what we're seeing on the streets in the US right now, and also in many places in the world, is a mass social movement. you know, what's exciting to me, whoever's old enough, and Julie, you said you were, but are to hear some of the leaders from the late 60s and early 70s saying this mobilization is larger than what was happening in the 60s and 70s in the US. And we all know that that had a huge influence on what came next in this country. But we have massive opportunities right now. But it is social movements that change social structures. Yeah, so this is why I'm probably going to come back and say this many times in this conversation, but connecting personal healing with social action. So one of the things, and Julie, I'm just going to ask you this as you don't actually have to answer it, but as we do our healing, the next question I'll have is, are you engaged in a social justice organization, giving your time and your money, right? If you have it. Yeah, so I'm not asking you though, Julie, thank you so much. But it is the question that we want to go, where are we putting our time and our money? How are we bringing just our resources, whatever our resources are, money's just one of them. But how are we moving our deep healing and the healing work that we're doing with ourselves and others into collective social action? Yeah, one of the reasons we at Generative Somatics bring healing and bring embodied transformation work or bring embodied leadership work specifically to social and environmental justice movements is to support our leadership becoming more transformative, our visions becoming more visionary, to make sure that in conflict we don't default into our deep traumas, right? Our deep traumas, and then kind of enact that and implode on each other instead of get to forward toward a collective vision together. It's also that all of us who have embodied privilege, right? So that can be based on gender, right? It can be based on race. It can be based on class. It can be based on nation, right? And origin. Any of us who've really embodied privilege, it's both a political act, right, to look to change systems that we've been privileged by, but it's also very, very deep personal work, right? So if I just talk about whiteness and white supremacy for a moment, one of the things that to me is so useful about somatics as a methodology is that it really looks at humans having core needs that we have evolved to adapt to, right? And we look at those needs as a need for safety, the needs for belonging, right? Loving and being loved, and the needs for dignity, yeah? So safety, belonging, and dignity. And as you all know, harm, oppression, trauma impact all three of those. And then we have these really amazing inherent, they come with our bodies, right? They come with the evolutionary wisdom in our bodies. We have these automatic ways that we can adapt if our safety, our belonging, or our dignity is threatened in some way. And I'm sure you've all worked with and kind of heard the fight response, flight, freeze, appease, and dissociate. Those are all automatic responses. We don't have to learn how to do those. Yeah. So we adapt, we adjust, right, to our families, to our communities, and to the broader conditions. So one of the deep pieces of work that I feel like many of us who are white have to do is to go, how did my interpretation, how did my perception of safety, belonging, and dignity actually get deeply tied to this idea that white is the dominant race? So we can see this all over the news and some of the places where white folks are really reacting to the racial justice uprisings on the street, or reacting to the idea of defunding the police and investing in community. You know, I watch the right TV shows and left TV shows, both, right? Or the right radio, just to go, how are people perceiving reality? And what is interesting is this perceived threat to safety, when there isn't actually a threat to safety through these changes or perceived threat to belonging. I don't know if you all know Van Jones. You know, he's now a CNN commentator, and I know him back from his organizing days in Oakland. But one thing he said is, he said, you know, if white supremacy is going to change, we really need to give white people a gentle place to keep knowing that they belong, just not belonging through domination, right? Belonging through belonging and being connected to everyone. That is all deep internal work and deep healing work that I think we've been shaped by our social conditions, right? We've been shaped by our social conditions around race, class, gender. Yep. And that lives in our tissues even when we don't agree with it. Even when we go, that is not my values, it still lives in our tissues, right? So thus the deep internal work really connected to mass movements for social change, joining organizations that are leading that work. So I hope my interconnections are making sense. I'm going to show us one more slide, and then I'm going to pause for questions again.
Stacey, could we ask you to actually describe the slide for anybody who's visually impaired as well?
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Hold on, I just need to change my view here. Give me 1 second. All right. All right. I have a very colorful slide in front of us right now that are a series of ever-expanding circles. And this is something that we call sites of shaping and sites of change. And in the very kind of smallest circle is the individual, then it expands to family and intimate network. It expands again to community, then institutions, then social norms and historical forces, then spirit and landscape. Yeah. One of the reasons we really created this slide is to help us all understand two things. One is, what is it that we are shaped by? Like, what are the multiple levels of our experience that literally live in our spirits, live in our tissues, live inside of us? And often our experiences we perceive as very personal, or we can perceive as personal or collective to our particular community. But it takes usually more kind of education and exposure to really be able to expand our attention out and go, wow, how have I been really shaped by the institutions that are around me, right? A small example that I think of is, for many of us, where we think about getting food is the grocery store. That is a very radically different experience than even 200 to 300 years ago, where we got food is in the place that we are cultivating it and in connection to the land. Now, many of us might have gardens too, and some of us might be farmers. But if we just think about food production and redistribution, those institutions so deeply shape our relationship to food, our relationship to land and where food comes from, and our relationship to the cycle and the abundance of the generosity of the earth. Social norms. We can look at, how was I really shaped? How do I embody what it is to be my gender? So I identify as female or as a woman. How have I been shaped? I've been deeply shaped by social norms and by institutions around how I perceive and how I move in the world, given that I am a female and was a girl, right? So even though it's very personally experienced, these wider circles have the greatest influence on the greatest number of people. So let me just say that again. While often in healing, we're working at the individual level, or what was the impact from family and intimate network, or maybe even community. The bigger the circle is on this chart, the broader number of people are influenced and shaped by what's happening there. In the other door, looking at this slide, each of these sites changes by a different set of activities. So individuals, families, and networks can really transform, go through a lot of transformation through healing work, through coaching, through family systems therapy, through taking on new practices together that are shared practices, through education, right? A lot of transformation can happen by those means. If we expand up to communities, community organizing can change things within communities. Collective practice or resilience practice within communities can change a lot. If we again go to these broader circles of institutions or social norms or historical forces, it takes masses of people organizing for the change of those institutions, for the redistribution of resources in an equitable way to actually change the influence on all of us of those systems. So again, when I talk about social movements and policy change and broad change in social narratives, or even in the rules of who gets the safety, belonging, dignity, and resources, right? That's really what we're trying to redistribute in an equitable way. So I'm gonna stop sharing again, and I really wanna open it up for questions. How are you all doing? Does any of this make sense? How do you relate to it?
Dory, if you'd like to go.
Hi, my question is if you could address, you've said a couple of times that our tissues hold beliefs that we disagree with. And on one level, I'm really getting and resonating that. But if you could share more, maybe some examples or how we identify those beliefs that we hold that we don't agree with, and how to work with them, both in ourselves and our clients.
Awesome, I love that. That was like 5 questions in one. That was good. Good, so of course, what's important with ourselves and our clients is to really be connected enough to like our hearts, our longings, our spirits, to deeply feel what is it that we do care about. And in having worked with people for so long, I really find that with enough softening, with enough healing, people care about love. People care about making a difference for each other. We care deeply, I think, about interdependence, right, of people and the planet, and about equity. And we have to go, when we have been raised in and live in domination-based social norms, what gets in is something really different than that. So one of the ways to see kind of what's embodied in you, or what lives in your habits or your tissues, where that is not aligned with your values, is to be under a lot of pressure, right? Under pressure, our oldest habits pop to the surface. So some of the places to look, especially from some of the places to look, are, do we isolate and separate under pressure? Do we pop out of ourselves and try to over caretake, and only later find that we've been disconnected with ourselves for a long period of time? Do we, under a lot of pressure, move to try to control everything, right? These can point to ways that the social norms are kind of deeper in our automatic habits and our reactions than, let's say, our values for interdependence, or our values for shared power, right? If I'm moving in and trying to control everything, which is really a training of white supremacy. When we look at white privilege or white supremacy, one of the trainings is let me control what's happening. Let me define what's happening, right? We can look at this around gender too. Where there's more privilege, there is more impulse to define the reality, to control the reality, and to decide the reality, right? That training is in any of us who situate in some position of privilege. So you can look at that. It's like, wow, do I need to insist on my way, even in small things that don't really matter? Yeah. Or when, let's say, we're in a conversation where we're looking deeply at oppression or even trying to help each other grow. That's a lot of pressure. Where are the places that we notice our own defensiveness or we notice our own insistence that we're right? Yeah. So those would be some of the places to look. Put yourself under pressure, just pop up, right and left. How to help ourselves and each other work with it. Again, because I haven't been trained at your school, I'm sure you have a million processes and tools that would be relevant. I'm just going to speak from my training. We tend to orient in a resilience-based, right, a resilience focus. So what do you care about? What matters to you? Who do you want to be? Those are the first questions that we can ask ourselves and each other, because it gives us a vision to go toward instead of what's wrong with me and what am I doing bad or wrong. Yeah, so what do you long for? What do you hope for? I often think about my, the piece about thinking 2 or 3 or 4 generations out. What do we want to leave? What do we want to leave, or what do we want our generation to be known for? Yeah, where were we brave? I think about that. And then we want to really do that exploration, like all of us do in our own processes, of what is embodied in my habits, in my practices, in my emotional skill or not skill that is not aligned with that vision, right? Then that reveals to us the places that we want to change or we want to transform. From a somatic viewpoint, we transform through taking on new practices, right? New embodied practices that align with our vision. And also we transform through really unearthing, right? What has been caught in our nervous system, in our tissues, right? In our musculature. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but I'm sure you all have many, many tools to help people really deeply know what they care about, and then help people know what limitations that they've embodied because of either their personal experiences or because of the social conditions and the impact of those. Yeah.
Thank you.
Kate.
Do we have another question?
Yes, Kate.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask if you had anything you could say to, in particular, how the school as an institution, as a spiritual, educational institution and a business, how it might address harm that is done. And I will say that in reflecting on my years there, I'm reflecting on my own racism these last, in particular, 6 years with the rise of Black Lives Matter, reflecting on how my mind has been impacted by white supremacy, and my heart in particular has been numbed to the suffering of Black people and others in the society. How my body has, like you were talking about, how my body holds that, and how my spirituality has been deeply impacted. And I've thought about how that happened when I was in Brennan also, not only my whole life. So I'm hoping that you can help with addressing how an institution, it's not like it's the court system, or it's a school, a spiritual school, a business, an educational institutions, how it might do that. Take accountability. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a great question. I appreciate your honesty in that. Well, one of the great pieces of news right now is so many organizations are asking themselves this question right now, right? And so many like well-meaning, even organizations that hold themselves as progressive are really going, oh, wow, there's a lot we've been missing. So there's a couple layers to it. Let me see if I can break this down in an easy way. So one thing that's important is that any organization that has not been, let's say, living an exemplar of racial justice or gender justice or a challenge to racial capitalism, right? If you're like, oh, whoops, we haven't been challenging these things and we've in some way been reenacting them, that there is a very important place for ongoing committed self-education. And in the social change world, it's called political education. And that's basically ongoing consciousness raising about how does racial capitalism work? How does power continue to get concentrated in very, very small numbers of people in a very, who are, it's predictable who they are, right? So there's an ongoing process of education through understanding or reading history, through learning from current social movements, through watching stuff, and then having conversations about it, right? That's part of the change process. In an organization, and I will get to kind of more of a reparations orientation, but in an organization, if you're really going to change the structure and the culture, you also really have to expand the leadership. And again, I don't know enough about your organization to know kind of who's in leadership or how decision-making works, but bringing people into lead who have an already deep embodiment of social and environmental justice values, right? So it is very much about widening racial diversity, gender diversity, and it's the values that are embodied in those leaders. Right? The values that are embodied in those leaders. You can really look at leadership and decision-making and how that's happening. And then to look through policies and practices and go, are there ways that we keep perpetuating white supremacy or male supremacy or stuff around class that we don't mean to? What do we need to change there? Yeah. So then really to your question about healing collectively, there are so many beautiful models of restorative justice and transformative justice. I mean, we can look at the truth and reconciliation processes from South Africa. And I mean, that's the largest scale at which it's been attempted. You know, that was a nation state taking on an attempt to heal white supremacy. Yeah. I mean, the United States hasn't even done that yet. You know, I really hope this is a moment where we face slavery and we face colonization of Indigenous people and we face it together and go, how can we heal these wounds together? How can we never repeat this? Yeah. You all know in healing, if we don't get to the core wound, we tend to repeat. Yeah. So it's great to have a facilitator who's external and who can hold a healing space of being able to really listen to the impact of the harm, validate what that harm was, any kind of education or understanding of that harm does not need to come from the person or the people who are most harmed, right? We want the education to come from other allies, so there's not extra kind of weight and labor for the people who've already been harmed, either individually or systemically. And, you know, I think we really undervalue apology. I just think there's something so profound to going, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry that I'm harmed you. I'm so sorry that we harmed you. I'm so sorry we didn't wake up earlier. Yeah. How can I be a part of, you're healing, right? So that kind of apology, and then a real accountability and self-reflection. And then to go, I'm going to be a part of changing this going forward, right? Because we really rebuild trust through new action over time. Yeah. One of my favorite understandings of the word trust is that it's intention plus competence plus reliability over time. And usually when we have a really big breakdown in trust, or there's been harm that needs mending, we either need to get our intentions aligned, then we need to build our skills. It's like, oh, wow, now I have the right competencies, which is what you're talking about. It's like, wow, you didn't know what you didn't know, and you were doing unskilled things, right? So we rebuild our skills and competency, and then we do it over time. We show it through our actions, right? It's really a good rule for being allies to each other also, are those three pieces. So Kate, did that speak to your question?
Yes, thank you. I think that was very helpful.
And next we have Jonathan.
All right, thank you, Stacey, for this. You've been speaking to a bunch of things that are very dear to my heart, you know, oh, sorry. I first of all want to acknowledge, right? I'm here on Tongva land, a town called Onge, California, and I am a colonizer, right? My ancestors came over on the boat in 1620. And there were 37 of us, right? And from those 37 that survived. And from those 37, there are now 35 million, right? So, so acknowledge that, and there's no words for the sorrow. There's no words for that. So within our lineage of this school, one of the progenitors of our lineage of characterology, Wilhelm Reich, was deeply concerned with exactly this this kind of paradox between the social and personal healing. You know, he was an anti-fascist during the rise of Hitler's Germany, right? And understood that the trauma that we experienced within our family shaped the forces that gave rise to fascism, right? The suppression of the body and the suppression of the female. So I want to just presence that within our lineage. And, you know, there's a calling within me in some ways to return to the radical nature of our work. That I think in places we've forgotten and gotten comfortable. And there's so much unknown with how to create a model of an organization that can where we can, you know, we can feed ourselves, we can make a living without perpetuating you know, the giant sucking hole of living within a debt-based monetary system. Right? I mean, it really feels like reaching for something that's there, but we don't have words for it. We can't see it yet. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to how to engage that process of pushing the edge of what's possible for an organization within the system we're existing in.
We can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry, I put myself on mute.
Okay.
So thank you for that. And you know, it's funny. Wilhelm Reich is also in the lineage of somatic work, and Elsa Gindler, who is also someone who did deep embodied healing work with the survivors of Nazi Germany. So I think if we turn around, we'll always find radicals at our backs, right? And I think that turning around and going, who are the radicals at our backs? And also where are the complexities? Like there's contradictions at our backs, and we want to be honest about those too. You know, you're asking a question about contradictions, and my guess is that we're gonna, you know, I think we're gonna live in this contradiction probably for the rest of our lives. But we live inside of an economic system of racial capitalism. That means capitalism, the combination between white supremacy and capitalism, right, that exploits the earth and exploits people's labor to concentrate wealth in a small number of people. So, and all of us need to eat, right, and have shelter and all that good stuff. There's actually a great organization, if you don't know it, it's called Resource Generation. And they're just doing amazing work in redistributing wealth, especially with young people who are inheriting wealth. It's an amazing organization that really looks at like, wait, where did we actually get this wealth from? Why is it being passed down generation to generation? And does that serve our values? And their answer is no. So I think, you know, the first thing that an organization can do is to really ask the question again, for whom do we exist? Yeah, for whom do we exist? And what future do we want to be a part of building? And to collectively answer that question very deeply and very honestly. And, you know, if I just speak for generative somatics, you know, you all are much older than we are, but we're, you know, 12 years old. And we really go, we exist to be, in our words, booster power, transformative booster power for social and environmental justice movements. Because we assess that they are on the front line of creating systemic change. So I think, and we'll keep asking that question, and we may answer it differently over time, but I think that question of for whom do we exist and toward what future? And then to really go, okay, given that, do we have kind of the array of people influencing our strategy and our programs, right? Then we go, okay, good. Now do we have a decision-making model that supports that, right? Is a collective or a collaborative decision-making model. So we keep getting influenced. And then we back into, great, how do we resource this thing, you know? And how much resources is enough resource? Yeah, I think why I mentioned resource generation is I'm sure this is a multi-class group. I grew up working class. I live pretty solidly middle class at the moment. But it is a very important question to go, can we be transparent about our resources with each other? And can we deeply ask that question, how much is enough given what I care about? Yeah, how much is enough given what I care about? Yeah, organizations need to ask that question too. How much is enough? No, I know you guys aren't like a multinational, multi-zillion-dollar organization. I know that's not who I'm talking to, right? I know you guys are probably like, you know, moving along day to day. But it's one of the questions that we can really ask ourselves as we're looking at who are we as an organization. So I'll pause there, and thanks, Jonathan, for your questions and words.
Thank you.
Yeah, Stacey, I think we have come to the end of our time, and unfortunately, and with great sadness. It's been such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I'm very, very appreciative that you all are doing this and feel very supportive. And I do, you know, that just maybe this is my last comment, you know, in healing, we get better at tolerating a wide range of energy and sensation, and also tolerating discomfort, right, for the sake of something much bigger. So I do have a trust right now that we're gonna figure this out together as healers and as social change leaders.
Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Thank you all.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks. Kai, where are you?
Right here. So thank you, Stacey Haynes. I have many, many things moving through my head from my training, and I want to take a moment and invite everyone to take a moment to embody what we've heard and where our bodies are taking us. So with your breath, just notice, where does your body hold constriction right now? Is there any dis-ease? And without judging your body, just bring breath and flow to any areas where you hold constriction. Maybe bring some self-massage or movement. Compassion to whatever is in the tissue that may have responded to the words of Ms. Haynes. Where does our personal healing work intersect with social action? Where can we bring our resources and our time, our money to social movement as we do our interpersonal work? So just be still for a moment and just be with your body, bring flow. Remind your body that we're part of a community here and feel the support of the collective breath. Thank you, Patricia, for weaving space between the speakers for our bodies and breath.
Thank you, Kai. So the afternoon goes on. We have two more speakers, two more presenters. Our next presenter is Hillary Jones. We invited Hillary because we have been talking so much about oppression and slavery and inequality, and I wanted someone to just speak to who were those early Africans who came to the U.S. And it's a way of kind of restoring their humanity. Hillary Jones is Associate Professor of History in the African and African Diaspora Studies program at Florida International University. She earned her doctorate degree in African history from Michigan State. In Jones's research and teaching, she pays close attention to the interconnected histories of Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Jones is the author of The Métis of Senegal, Urban Life and Politics in French West Africa. Based on field work conducted in Senegal and France, the book examines Senegal's colonial capital through the lens of people of mixed race ancestry. Thank you, Hillary. Welcome to the Brennan School of Healing.
Thank you. Let me unmute myself. Hello, everyone. And can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah. All right, it's so nice to be with you today, and for allowing me to listen in a bit on Stacey's presentation just a moment ago. I really appreciated that. So let me also say thank you to Patricia for inviting me. And in our conversation, one of the things that she said to me was that, well, you know, what we're trying to do in the school and in this series is to get a better understanding of the humanity of Africa, or humanizing Africa. And I thought, well, that's right up my alley, because as a historian and a historian of Africa, one of my primary goals is to think about the past through the eyes, through the lens of people of the continent of Africa. And to put ourselves not only in their shoes, but in their shoes in another time period, in an earlier time period. So what I thought I would do today, I do have a PowerPoint, and so maybe what I'll do is share my screen, and then I don't know if I can share my screen. Maybe I can, let's see.
Should be able to.
I should be able to. Let's do this first. And then.
And again, if you can just describe any pictures for those visually impaired.
All right. Let's see. It doesn't have. What is it? I thought I had this. Okay, can you all see that? No, share. There we go. All right, almost. Okay. All right, it takes me a minute to get it worked up. So what I'm going to talk to you today, I'm going to talk about Africa in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. But what I thought I would do is to start with a few questions. And let me just say that the way that I work is that I usually write things out and then, you know, I talk about them. But I think it's much nicer for us to do kind of a back and forth. And so the three big kind of categories or questions that I want to address today are the three that you see on the screen. Why do the words that we use to describe Africa matter? What was Africa in the era of the transatlantic slave trade? So here, sort of thinking about the social, economic, political systems in the period of the transatlantic slave trade. And then finally, what can we learn about the African experience of Atlantic slavery from studying the past? So as we begin here, I thought what I would do is let you sort of look at this slide for a moment, and I'll describe it in just a second. And so I'll give you a moment to sort of look over it, to pause, to think about it. And I want to ask everyone a question to start out, which is, how many languages do you think are spoken in the country of Nigeria? So think on that, look at the slide. This is a slide that says Africa is not a country, exclamation mark, on one side. And then on the other side of the screen, there's a map that's called How Big is Africa? And there's a small table on the side that tells us that the approximate area in square miles of Africa is 11,668,545 square miles. And what we're looking at on the slide is a map that shows us most of Europe, but not all of Europe, basically all of the continental United States, Alaska, China, and a little left over fit into the continent of Africa. All right? So to return back to that question, how many languages, and maybe if there's just one or two people who want to venture a guess, how many languages do you think are spoken in the country of Nigeria? anyone who's brave enough to raise their hand. I don't know if I'm supposed to moderate the questions or if...
I can.
Okay, that's helpful.
Jennifer Nelson.
Yes, thank you. About over 700 languages.
That's close. At least from the information that I know. But 700 is not a bad guess. Anybody want to venture one more guess? I'll give you one hint. Huh? Less than 700.
$14.
14, too low. So 700 on the high side, 14 on the low side. 500 languages are spoken in the country of Nigeria. 500 distinct languages, not dialects, not accents, but 500 distinct languages. And so when linguists have studied and classified the known languages on the African continent, so that doesn't account for those that are no longer spoken, they categorize somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 different and distinct languages. Now, those languages have patterns and can be grouped into clusters that relate to one another, but it tells you something about the diversity of the African continent. So the first point that we should sort of hold in our minds is that Africa is not a country, right? I'm in Miami right now, and in Miami, what we hear every night on the news is, well, there are storms that are brewing off of the coast of Africa. That doesn't really tell us much, right? Where in Africa? Geographically, what does that mean? So we have to think about Africa in terms of this vast diversity, continent of 54 countries today, of 1,000 to 2,000 languages. If we measured the square area of Africa by miles, we could fit 11 billion, with a B, football fields. So we're talking about many, many different kinds of people, many different kinds of places. And I'd also just add here that it's important to think about the fact that not all of the African continent was connected to or affected by the transatlantic slave trade or Atlantic commerce, right? North Africa, the Horn of Africa, much of Southern and Southwestern Africa were not integrated into the Atlantic systems the ways that West Central Africa and Southeast Africa were. But we'll get to that in just a moment. The second point that I want to talk about under this sort of looking at and thinking about the words that we use and why they matter is to get us to just think about the fact that much of the language that we have to even describe Africa and African peoples from the vantage point of the West comes from an outsider's perspective, right? It's Westerners who are described Africa. So that, for example, one of the most common words that is associated with African people is tribe. Africans live in tribes, right? There's tribal dance. And some of you probably understand that these are problematic terms. It's problematic for Africa in particular because tribe doesn't really tell us much. It doesn't tell us if we're talking about people who organized in groups of tens or thousands, if they all spoke the same language, if they lived in a kingdom, or if they lived in more decentralized state systems. In addition, the word tribe in and of itself is something that's inherited in English, and the word in English is inherited from the Latin word tribus, which the Romans used in ancient Rome to describe the 3 to 5 different political systems or designations that made up the Roman Empire. When the British and the French and the Germans came to Africa as colonial in the period of colonial rule at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, and they established colonial empires, they used the word tribe to describe African people, much in the way that they used terms like Welsh, or that terms like Welsh or Saxon were used to describe European peoples in pre-modern times. right? So they kind of made the same equivalence, and they used the construct of tribe as a means of dividing different African people in order to administer them, in order to rule them, in order to create colonial designations. So in certain ways, the idea of tribe is something that really gets invented and at least fixed in our minds as something that is concrete in the colonial period, which is much more recent than the era of the transatlantic slave trade. So lastly, on these notions of Africa, well, first, let me explain this slide, and then I'll ask one additional question. So the slide that we're looking at now is a cover. On one side, there's the cover of the 50th anniversary edition of the novel Things Fall Apart, which some of you may be familiar with. Chinua Achebe is known as really Africa's first, or in the generation of Africa's first post-colonial novelists. Toni Morrison said of Chinua Achebe that he was the first person that she read who made it okay to tell the story of Africa or of Black people without using any white characters at all, right? That in other words, Chinua Achebe in Things Fall Apart wrote because he wanted to counter the narratives of works like The Heart of Darkness, for example, that were set in Africa, but were void of African people, that described Africa as these, sort of empty spaces or lands of darkness, right? The dark continent. And so Chinua Achebe, in his lifetime and his career, really worked against that notion. And on the slide, we have one of his, a quote from one of his speeches, or excuse me, not speeches, one of his essays, in which he writes, "There is a desire, one might say the need, in Western psychology to set Africa up as a foil to Europe, as a place of negations at once remote and vaguely familiar, in comparison with which Europe's own state of spiritual," I wrote grade, it should be grace, Europe's own state of spiritual grace will be manifest, right? So I'll read it one more time. "There is a desire, one might say the need in Western psychology to set Africa up as a foil to Europe, as a place of negations at once remote and vaguely familiar, in comparison with which Europe's own state of spiritual grace will be manifest." What do you think that means? Or how do you interpret that statement? Do I see a hand up, or someone want to volunteer? I tell you what, I will, because I can't tell if, I'm not looking to see if someone has weighed in, but I'm going to add on something here, right? Sit with that for a moment. But let's ask this question. Most of our images of Africa, at least from our vantage point in the United States, the image that we consume of Africa is often one of war, of famine, of disease, of corruption, of lack of technology. What's problematic about that? Or is it, maybe you don't think it's problematic, but why do we need to interrogate that? I see a raised hand.
Shelamaya. Shelamaya, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Shelamaya. I am from Miami currently. I was born here. I'm sitting on Tequesta land. Just want to give honor to Tequesta people. I'm sorry, I get so nervous when I speak in such a large group. What's troublesome about that is is that, you know, it's a story that's being told by the people who are holding the power. It's a story that, at least for me, okay, the little old me, the way that I look at it is, it's problematic because when looking at the way that this society functions, it's all about consumption. And so at this point, we have consumed an image of human beings, and it has so much filled the consciousness and our capacity to really take them in that we don't really know the people.
Okay. Exactly.
Stops us from getting to know the people because it's also such a frightening image.
Okay.
And it kills our empathy.
Okay. And if I can come back in here, I'm so glad that you said that because I think that puts a really sharp point on what we're dealing with, right? And that is that the words we use often prevent us from knowing who the people are that we are actually referring to when we say Africans or Africa, right? And that we have to work through our language in order to really see Africa the way that people on the continent see themselves. You know, oftentimes, and I just came back from 3 months in Senegal before the pandemic, which brought me back. So you know, it's fresh in my mind, but I'm always struck by the ways in which my friends in Senegal see themselves in a completely different way than we, and I mean we, the royal we, see Africa, right? That they wouldn't recognize the Africa that's often described in our movies and on television. So one more question. So yes, the image of broken Africa is problematic, but what about the image of Africa as Wakanda, to use a popular culture reference? Because if on the one hand we sort of we go between the idea of broken Africa, we also want to hold on to this kind of romantic Africa, right? Maybe someone else wants to just add in here. What is problematic about that?
First of all, to answer even the first question, it's an image of less than or scarcity. So it makes one feel that the white person is greater than, in other words. And the other image is an image of abundance. And again, then it makes one feel that that group of people are actually better or greater than white people. Okay. And they don't like that.
Okay, all right. So it vacillates between these two extremes, scarcity and abundance. I'm going to use it in scare quotes, backwardness, or a kind of untouched, unbridled nature, right? That's not been touched by the corruption of the West. And so both of those things are problematic. And we tend to want to go between one of those two extremes. So how do we get back to thinking about Africa, especially in the era of the Atlantic slave trade, from a more holistic point of view? And this is what Chinua Achebe is saying here in his essay From Hopes and Impediments, that the language that we use to describe Africa was also set up intentionally to reify the West and to denigrate Africa, right? If you have civilization, you have to have the image of what's not civilized, right? If the idea of colonizing in Africa was about Europe's civilizing mission, they had to define somebody else as uncivilized. Mm-hmm. Right? And so, you know, I think that part of what I do in my teaching is help our students to think beyond and move beyond those kinds of images. So I want to spend a little time now talking about what I came here to talk about, or what connects to what you've been working on, right, in your studies and thinking about reconciliation, about race, and about slavery, and about these legacies, is how can we, or how do we understand the continent of Africa in the period of the transatlantic slave trade? There's so much to say, and it's very difficult to just say this in a short time period, but I want to give you some just kind of very broad brushstrokes so that you have a kind of overview picture from the perspective of what we as historians know through our documentation, through oral history work, through understanding African traditions, archaeology, linguistic studies, etc., right? So on the screen, you have a slide. On one side, it says African regions of the Atlantic slave trade, and I'll read you the key bullet points under this, and then I'll go back through it and explain those bullet points. So the Atlantic, I'm going to use the term Atlantic commerce now, but transatlantic commerce begins really about 1450s or so. The age of exploration started earlier than that. But these commercial networks really began to get generated around 1470, 1480, largely as a result of the migration of sugar production from the Mediterranean islands to Sao Tome and Principe off the coast of West Central Africa. Before there were Africans brought from continental Africa to Brazil, which was the first major sugar producing economy, Brazil and Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Before we see the arrival of Africans in those regions of the New World for sugar production, Africans were brought from West Central Africa to the West Central Islands there in the Bight of Biafra, or a little bit further down from the Bight of Biafra, called Sao Tome and Principe. In fact, the first slave revolts we know of occurred in Sao Tome and Principe. And so by 1480s, there was a trade in slaves going to Sao Tome and Principe and then gradually to the New World. By the 17th century or the 1600s, we approximate that about 10,000 captives were exported per year in the 1600s. The Portuguese monopolized the trade, and then the Dutch came in after the Portuguese, and after the Dutch, the English and the French, the Germans, the Danish, it became open to other nations. But essentially, what we know from demographic study is that the height of the transatlantic slave trade occurred between 1700 and 1800 in a century. And in that century, there were approximately 6.4 million captives who were brought out of the continent. But between 1750, during that time period, or let me say this, of that 6.4 million captives, approximately a third were trafficked between 1750 and 1800. Okay, so did everybody understand that? That is, the height of the Atlantic slave trade occurs in the 18th century, 100 years, in which 6.4 million captives are exported. But of that 6.4 million, a third of them were exported in the span of 50 years. Just to put that into comparison for you, we estimate that the total volume of the Atlantic slave trade was about 12.5 million, accounting for a 10% mortality rate. That means that about 10.8 million people lived to disembark in ports of the Americas. Approximately 13 million to 14 million slaves. It's harder for the slave trade into the Middle East and North Africa and the Eastern world because we don't have the same documentation. But scholars approximate that about 14 million people crossed the Sahara, crossed the Red Sea, crossed the Indian Ocean into these other regions of the East, let us say. But the difference is that that trade started at about 500 before the Common Era, 500 BC, right? And moved all the way up until 1800. So it's approximately the same amount of people over a much longer span of time. In the transatlantic slave trade, approximately 1/3 were women and 28% were children. So on the side of your screen that has this map, I want you to notice a couple of things. One is that the areas that are marked on this map are areas that correspond largely to the approximate volume of trade out of these various regions. So what you should notice first is that the main regions of the transatlantic slave trade, or let me put this another way. What you should notice about this map, and I'll start from kind of the north and move south. The territories that are marked as Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast were among the first places that Portuguese sailors arrived and were among the first places to supply captive people to the transatlantic slave trade. They were also important later in the transatlantic slave trade in that period of after 1700. But in general, they supplied a less of a volume in the transatlantic slave trade than the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa. West Central Africa and the Bight of Biafra supplied the vast majority of enslaved Africans during the entire period of the transatlantic slave trade. That is from 1500 all the way until the period of the illegal slave trade in the 19th century, followed by captives from the Bight of Benin and the Gold Coast. Southeast Africa and Madagascar become more, really Southeast Africa, become more important to the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. Scholars also refer to the 19th century as the period of the illegal slave trade. And the reason for that is because the British outlawed the international trade in 1808. The United States and their constitution that was ratified in 1808, I believe, followed. The Danes outlawed the slave trade in 1790. But once the British outlawed the slave trade, they pressured other nations to do the same. Not all of them did, and a clandestine trade still occurred wherever slavery existed, right? The desire to find new supplies of slaves also existed. And so that we know that even though the British Navy was patrolling the Atlantic for illegal slave trading vessels that they would arrest, try, and then quote unquote resettle the cargo. This happened, this is how we get the settlers of Sierra Leone. So people of Sierra Leone, the Creoles of Sierra Leone, were people who had been enslaved in all of these regions across the continent, but were arrested aboard illegal slavers at sea and then brought to the port in Freetown and were resettled in what is today the country of Freetown. The British called it the Province of Freedom, right? Because then it was this experiment in creating a colony of freed slaves. But that 19th century, what that meant in the 19th century is that a clandestine slave trade existed to supply markets, specifically in Cuba and Brazil, which did not end slavery until the 1860s in Cuba, in the case of Cuba, and the 1880s in the case of Brazil. And in the United States, even though it was illegal, we know that the last slave ships arrived on the southern coast of the United States in Key West, in Mobile, Alabama, as late as the 1850s. And if any of you are familiar with the work of Zora Neale Hurston, a native of Florida, but also one of the first Black women anthropologists in the 1920s, she interviewed survivors of the last slave ship. And those survivors became the inhabitants of a place called Africatown in Alabama. And the story of the last surviving member of that slave ship is recorded in her field notes, which has recently been published in a book called Barracoon. And I provided for you all a list with some supplemental readings, and that title is part of the supplemental readings. Okay. So let me move to the next slide. So in order to just kind of break down for you, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but I do want to give you a sense of the landscape in terms of the economic and social and political dynamics within the continent. I've presented for you two slides here. On the left is a watercolor by an Italian priest named Antonio Cavazzi, who was assigned to the Congo Kingdom. The pre-colonial kingdom is known as the Congo Kingdom with a K. And he was assigned to the Congo Kingdom between 1672 and 1677. And he did these watercolors of one of the northern states called Kwanzaa North. And one of the key things to kind of understand about the Congo Kingdom and about many of the kingdoms in this region of West, specifically the forest regions of West and West Central Africa, is that Atlantic commerce allowed for the expansion of states in this region that had previously not been connected to long-distance trade networks. So let me back up here for a second. I'll come back to this beautiful watercolor painting in a moment. But to give you a bit of context for what I'm talking about here, some of you may be familiar with the miniseries Roots, that was produced by Alex Haley in the 1970s, and people saw it all over the United States, and it's been shown ever since then. You can see it now. But there's a scene in Roots in which Kunta Kinte, who was the main character, he was an African, came from the Gambia River in this account, who was kidnapped and then sold into slavery in what became the United States in North America, was said to have come from the Gambia River, the town called Jufre in the Gambia River. And in the opening sequence of the miniseries, the first thing you see is Kunta Kinte being hit, kind of hit over the head, dragged out by kidnappers. And it's sort of given us this lasting impression that kidnapping by European slavers was the main form, the main method of enslavement. And that was not the case. The Portuguese figured out very early on, they tried kidnapping in the 1470s and 1480s, and they were swiftly met with African resistance, right? And so as a result, what they came to understand was that it was more effective to tap into the very sophisticated and complex long-distance trade networks that already existed on the African continent. And if you kind of think about what we call Africa's golden age of trade and states, African people had perfected the camel caravan trade across the Sahara, bringing goods from between North Africa and the forest regions of West Africa. They perfected trade with Indian Ocean trading partners who crossed the monsoon waters on the East African side of the continent. They perfected the Nile Valley trade. So they had systems of long distance trade already in place. There were also systems of slavery that existed within African societies. And I can talk a little bit more about that in questions. There's a lot to go into there, but I think, you know, the basic thing to sort of think through is that the notion of slavery in African societies was not necessarily the same notion of slavery that we have in the system of chattel slavery in the New World. But people who were not free knew and understood that they were not free. Right? And one of the markers by which people understood their status of freedom or unfreedom was that burial rights were denied to those who were slaves and of slave origin. And in studying systems of slavery in Africa, what anthropologists and historians have found is that one of the markers of difference perhaps in the system of slavery in the African context is that generation after generation, each generation had a little bit more freedom than the next generation. there might not have been a word called slave the way that we say slave. But the word for example, in Kikongo, the word for freedom, or the word for freedom was to be a Bakongo, right? It meant to belong to the Congo people. And so not being free meant that you were not one of the Congo people. So there were generations of incorporation that gave successive generations a little bit more freedom. One of the sort of implications of that is that as we get down into current day times, slavery is not a recognized, slavery is illegal, right? It's not a recognized legal institution, but the idea of attachment, right? Attachment to families, the idea that people could be in servitude to other families still exists, but it is really taboo to talk about slavery, right? Because talking about slavery or labeling someone as a descendant of slaves is akin to dishonoring someone, right? And I'm saying that from the sort of context of African society. And if you're interested, I can sort of speak a little bit more about that when we have some time for questions. But I just want to move through these couple of slides and point out a few things that I hope will give you a little bit of a better understanding. So in places like the Congo Kingdom, where there was a hierarchical organization, kings, the king, his nobility all lived in a capital. In the capital of the kingdom, there was often a court. There were market centers. There were clerics. There were leaders of traditional religions, people who were the protectors of the shrines to ancestors and the upholders of the traditional religion. But in places where Islam was important, there might also be Muslim populations. There might also be, in the case of Congo, Roman Catholic priests whose job it was, who were sent from the Vatican to minister to the nobility. But in the Congo Kingdom, the Mani Congo, or the King of Congo, was very keen to keep those outside influences relegated to the nobility. So in other words, the priests did not have free reign to just go and minister to anyone in the kingdom, but they were there to serve the royal family. And the kings were interested in things like building of churches, the architecture that the priests brought with them, for example, the systems of writing that the priests brought with them. The Congo nobility began having artisans make bronze crosses in their style, in their imagination. And there were even Christian prophetess movements. One of them was led by a woman whose name was Beatrice Kimpavita, who was known as the Congolese Saint Anthony, because she led a group of Congolese in opposition to the nobility, because, as she explained through Saint Anthony, the nobility were oppressing the people and were raiding for slaves in a manner that was illegal and unjust. Mm-hmm. And so this watercolor painting is a watercolor painting from the 17th century by this Italian priest. And what he draws here, it says in Italian, evangelical mission across the top of the page. And then in the drawing, we see 3 soldiers in the background. We see probably a titled person, so perhaps someone who was given a royal title by the chief, presenting a raffia cloth to the chief or the ruler of North Kwanza in a demonstration of loyalty. Now, I don't have much context to go from here, but it would not be unusual for textiles to be used as a means of securing bonds of affiliation. We know, for example, that in West Africa, there were ruling elites who demanded that European traders bring certain qualities of cloth, certain types of silks as trade objects, because they then unwove that silk and used the fabric, used the threads to make these beautiful kente cloths that were then given to other members of the nobility as a way of shoring up power and authority. So this might have been a typical protestation of that kind of loyalty. It may have been a raiding party who came back from raiding villages or areas of people who are more vulnerable, capturing slaves and presenting this cloth, and perhaps also presenting slaves to the member of the nobility to signify the expansion of political power. And so I should just say here that in much of our research, one of the things that comes to light in documentation across these areas is that slaves were largely acquired. The main method of acquiring captives was warfare. But warfare could have been wars on battlefields, as well as razzias or raiding parties that would raid villages that were vulnerable, perhaps were not part of the inner circle of the state's power, and for which a ruling elite was attempting to shore up their power or their authority. So that's the watercolor that we see on the first half of the slide. On the second half of the slide, there is one of my, well, I should say, it is one of my favorite books, because it was written by, at the time he was called Mulatto, he would have been known as Mulatto, but a biracial priest, indigenous person from Senegal in West Africa, in the Senegal River Valley, just at the northern part of Senegambia that you saw on the map. And David Boya, this priest, went through the Wolf Kingdoms and did watercolors of all different kinds of people, nobility, but also merchants, various different kinds of individuals. And this was a portrait that he drew of the queen of the Wolf Kingdom of Wallo, whose name was Ndate Yala. Linguère is the Wolof term for queen. And Ndate Yala lived between 1810 and 1860. Abi Boyat captured this portrait around 1850 or so. And in addition to noticing, you know, her beautiful fabrics, right? The pagne or wraparound skirt that she's wearing, and the tunic, and the blue indigo dye, which was a very important trade good for people of the Senegal River Valley. It came from Mauritanians, from Moors who lived on the north banks of the Senegal River Valley. She's adorned in that blue indigo, but she's also smoking a pipe. And the tobacco and the pipe might have been local, but more likely were trade goods that were brought in by Europeans, who oftentimes would go to other parts of the continent to find the goods that African rulers wanted to exchange, not just for people, not just for captives, but also for various kinds of trade goods, such as ivory carvings. Right, the European nobility commissioned ivory carvings from African craftsmen in various parts of West Africa. You'll also notice that she's wearing, on top of the sort of rose-colored tunic, she's wearing an amulet or a pouch, a square pouch as a kind of necklace. And typically inside of those square pouches, a Muslim cleric would bless a passage of the Quran or write out a certain kind of teaching, put that teaching inside of this leather pouch made by a craftsman, and people, ordinary people, would keep that above their door. Hunters would wear tunics covered in those amulets. And that was a practice that went back to a time before Islam. But for the people of the Wallo Kingdom, Islam was a religion that was known to them going back centuries and centuries and centuries. But by the early 19th century, the people of Walla were Muslim. Right? And so for them, it was also important to honor the teachings of Islam, but also to sort of use the teachings of Islam as a way to shore up their political power during this time period. Okay, so I'm gonna show you one more slide and then I'm gonna pause because I think I've probably talked your ears off for the moment. But I do want to include this photograph. This is a photograph of a stilt village called Ganvier, which is in a lacustrine delta. That's where a number of lakes kind of meet in this very well-watered environment close to the Atlantic Ocean. There are rivers and lakes, and then the Bight of Benin, or the Bay of Benin, in which the people of Ganvier, who are known today as Tofinu, settled and built these stilt villages. And you can see them, you can see these villages are literally made of straw dwellings, you know, maybe we could call them huts, that stand in the water, right? That stand in the water, that people travel between homes to the marketplace on canoe. And we see a picture of two canoemen in their pirogues or their canoes traveling in between the stilt villages. What's significant about Ganvier in Tofinbe, which is the language of the Tofino people, Ganvier means safe at last. And the reason that it means safe at last is because in the 17th century, when these villages were founded, Fon speakers and Aja speakers were seeking places where they could escape the raiders of the kings of, or the warriors of the kings of the Dahomey kingdom. So typically, you know, these large centralized kingdoms were structured in such a way that to expand their power, they raided people who lived on the outskirts of their kingdom. And the more that they could bring people inside the kingdom, the more that they shored up their power, right? And when they raided people, they took the byproduct of that were captives. In the transatlantic slave trade, some captives were kept inside, right? Were kept inside of Dahomey, but many others were sold out. And the Atlantic slave trade then created a cycle in which slave raiding generated more and more slaves and more insecurity. And people had to band together and find ways to protect themselves from slave raiders. So one of the things we see in West and West Central Africa is that African people sought refuge in swamps, in these lacustrine areas, in mountains, in places where they could have good natural refuge. And Ganvier was such a place. And so the Aja and Fon speakers who created the settlement told other people who were trying to protect themselves from slave raiding, come, join us in Ganvier, and you can be part of our community. And all of those people who spoke different languages eventually came to call themselves Tofinu, and commonly spoke the same language, Tofinbe, right? So I want to just end here by saying that when we think about Africa in the period of the Atlantic slave trade, think about the fact that these are societies that were governed by hierarchical kingdoms with kings and nobilities who lived in capitals, with fishermen, farmers, and pastoralists who lived in the countryside far away from the capital and in very autonomous spaces as long as they maintain loyalty to the center of power. But around those kingdoms were decentralized societies, sometimes of nomads, but at other times of settled agricultural people who lived in extended family groups of tens, of maybe 100. and who govern themselves in decentralized states by councils of elders, male elders and female elders, in which power was not inherited from one's status as a noble, but was rather conferred through honorific titles. So people like the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria, the Bight of Biafra, Chinua Achebe was Igbo. Right? Came from, and one of the things that Chinua Achebe was sort of known for saying was that when he grew up speaking Igbo, he just knew his family, the villages that he grew up with, the small groups of people that gathered together in the marketplaces and congregated. It wasn't until he went to Catholic schools in the colonial capital that he realized there are Igbo across this whole region, right? People who speak the same language as I do, who have the same traditions as I do, who pray to the same ancestral shrines as I do. And so, you know, it's important to also think of that dynamic, right? That there were people who also lived in those kinds of environments. Okay, I've said a lot and I have completely lost track of my time. But Patricia, I'm going to stop here and take questions. And if we have a moment or two at the end, I'll just share with you a few stories of biographies that may be of interest.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hillary. This has been really informative, really great. I think we might only have time for one question. Is there a burning question?
Oops.
Randall, are there any questions lurking about?
There was one in the chat from Alleycat who said, were any of the slave traders of Africa descendants training for food, etc.?
Did that again? Can you repeat that again? I'm not sure I understand. Were any of the
slave traders of African descent, question, or were they trading for food and other items?
Oh, okay. Yes, because as I was saying earlier, the slave trade really operated because Europeans were able to tap into the trade networks that already existed. So on the coast, there were peoples who emerged and became powerful as sort of merchant kings, largely because they could control the intermediary trade. They were intermediaries between Europeans on the coast and African rulers in the interior. They would negotiate the customs that Europeans had to pay to the rulers, the sovereign rulers, who demanded customs in order for Europeans to trade on their lands. African rulers worked with them in order to provide.
The password is BBSH.
In order to provide resources. In essence, support the traders, the middlemen traders. So the slave trade worked in large part because there were already those trade networks and there were intermediary traders, and those traders were Africans. It wasn't really until captives were brought to the pens, the barracoons, locations on the coast, and oftentimes this was a ship-to-shore trade, that European slavers controlled the trade and then controlled what happened from that point across the Middle Passage into the New World, and from the disembarkation of New World ports to their sale. First to certain Caribbean islands, and then from Caribbean islands to places in North and South America.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Hillary.
You're welcome.
I so appreciate you joining us and sharing so much of that information with us, that history.
It's a lot to take in, and I'm sure that you'll have space in your own discussions to process it, think through it. I did want to leave you with just some information about the fact that you know, when we're thinking about who both the enslaved were and who Africans were in the time of the Atlantic slave trade, there are a number of really wonderful biographies of African people who were enslaved in the New World but came directly from African places. And I put those on that list of suggested readings that you're free to circulate. Domingos Alvarez, Prince Abdul Rahman, who was in Mississippi and was Muslim and who made his way back to Africa, to Liberia. And then the story of Anna Majigan Jai Kingsley, for those of you in Florida, who was a Senegalese woman who was the wife of Zephaniah Kingsley, one of the most famous plantation owners in Florida and in Haiti in the 19th century. So you have a list there, and you can sort of refer back to that list if you're interested in reading more.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Kai, could you prepare us for our next presenter?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones, for that very intimate, detailed exposure to the vastness of Africa. And many of us, I'm sure, this is sadly new, that we weren't taught in school. So with your breath, just create space to receive all the teaching, all the data, all the stories. Create movement with your breath, conscious awareness where your body needs it. And in this space of flow and connection to your body, allow the final receiving as we feel gratitude for our speakers. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Kai. Our final presenter, and Lisa, I hope that we can continue over. We will need extra time. Our next presenter is Sherry Isaiah Monet Pei. She's a grandmother, an artist, a teacher, and healing presence, passionate about supporting people in actualizing the fullness of their multidimensional, unconditioned nature through mutual awakening and intentional community. Sherry taught for many years, for over 2 decades at the Brennan School, and she served as both teacher and administrator. Since leaving BBSH in 2015, she has been offering workshops and gatherings rooted in the principles of Ubuntu, the alchemy of the body, and the divine feminine aspects of her humanness. She was involved in the creation of the Chances for Change organization and is co-creator of the Body Tarot. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you, Patricia. It's a long day, a long journey to arrive to this moment right here. So, and I'm aware on many levels, also the level of my whiteness about the time. So, I want to just begin where I like to begin, which was going into the place of stillness within for just a moment. For many reasons. One, because that's the place from which all arises. And from secondly, because there's been so much. I've been here through all of these, listening to everyone from the beginning, taking in what's been happening here, feeling how it's impacting this field and all of those who gather here, as well as the collective. So I just want to take a moment to honor that convergence of energy and consciousness that has brought each of us here in this moment to create this group body. This now point through which consciousness is pushing us in evolution, in revolution, in revelation, and initiation. I want to take a moment to honor our ancestors and the lineage of BBSH, to honor that which each of us is the common ground for each of us that has brought us here, which is Barbara. And as Julie Murray, dear one, had spoken to last week, that in many other places, in many other spiritual communities, these conversations are not happening. And her question was, wow, it's amazing it's happening here. It is no coincidence. Considering the lineage that runs through Barbara's ancestry, the lineage that runs through her, that her forefathers participated in the founding and the writing of the Constitution. It's no coincidence that her lineage is connected to the star beings. And those that guide us from the unseen world. And I'm very aware that each one here has a convergence and a confluence of energy and lineage and ancestors that comes from many portions of this earth, that brings all of us converging together in this moment, this now point, to bring forth through us an initiation into a new way of being. I brought, in preparation for this, I have no idea what to teach about. I teach what arises, what the group body calls forth is what happens. So what I did today was I spent my day and going through the process I've been going through these past weeks and being here with all of you and having the privilege to live with Nathan, who some of you met last week, and are going through the conditioning of racism in this America and how it's influenced each of us and our relationship. And the healing that it's brought forth from us, the karma that's being cleared because of it is profound. We know that it's influencing the collective, the work that we're doing together. So today, in my preparing for this to be here with all of you to speak, what I did was collect, and what I do, and what Nathan and I do, is I collected, we have an altar in our home, always. It's part of our ritual to remember the spirituality. It's part of our life. It is not separate. In the white racist society, it's often only on Sunday. Nathan's father was a minister, and he went to church every day. It was part of his culture, and all day on Sunday. So in our house, we have an altar. And so on our altar is pictures of his parents, his ancestors. A picture of my ancestors, my father. And it's, we have representations of the land from which we each have come from, that we know is part of us. For me, that's India, it's Israel, it's the Sinai, it's Egypt. It's Ireland, it's the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. It's this land here in Maryland where we live very close to where Harriet Tubman lived and where she had her Underground Railroad. So on the altar is all of that. Barbara's there. There's a statue of Anubis from Egypt, who was the guardian of the underworld. There's a cloth that is handmade from dyes of the earth that I received at a time from one of the gatherings of another teacher of mine, Emily Conrad, who developed the Continuum movement, who was one who also taught me about embodiment of the elements and the water and opening oneself to the embodiment of our multidimensional selves. On the altar is representation of all the elements to help to remind us of the truth. As Elder St. Onge said today, the truth that we are the elements, we are nature, we are the earth. And we have ceremony here, Nathan and I together. We have ritual. And so I would encourage each of you in your lives to create your rituals and to consider what we give our awareness to, what we give our energy to, what we give our consciousness to. One of the things I just want to say when Alter Patricia was speaking also was she said that the natives have become invisible. So it feels important for me to share that there is a Native American running for president. I don't know if anybody here knows it. Everybody I tell, hardly anybody says, oh, I knew that. His name is Mark Charles. He's a Navajo Indian. He is amazing. He speaks about the need for us to rewrite a common story, because the story of America is only a white racist story that we hear. His running mate, his vice presidential running mate, is a member of the Green Party. She's a Black American woman. Actually, her family came from Jamaica. So just to say that it's interesting to me that he's remained invisible, and he is running for president. He wants to rewrite the Constitution, as each one gets to tell their stories and make reparations. I also wanted to say when Stacey was speaking and talking about tolerating, given my own work with trauma, I don't know that many of you know me or not that that's important, but my own work for trauma and my own body and my own history in terms of clearing the terror that gets left in the field when one is so severely traumatized. And I know that territory for myself personally which happened, by the way, around my being in love with a Black man and the police stepping in to make sure that my father knew. My father, who was a man, many of you might be too young to know this, was a man who voted for George Wallace, was a man who was very prejudiced, bigoted, who wanted me to hate and be afraid of Black men. And so, as life had it, the first man I fell in love with was a young Black man. So my trauma became around my father holding a gun to my head to wait for the good Lord to tell him whether or not I should live. And I was handed over to him by the police. So the deconstructing and living through and becoming aware of how that trauma kept me encapsulated and unable to speak out at times around different injustices or different abuses that I felt, and having to constantly learn how to breathe through. So I want to say to each one here, I can tolerate a lot. And I want to say to you, because I've seen a lot of trauma, I've experienced a lot of trauma, and I want to say to each of you, there is a time to break through the tolerating. There is a time to let life have its way with you. And so tolerating aliveness, tolerating trauma, I see us at that point of initiation, like I spoke earlier, that we're at a time, an initiation to let life have its way with us. I love Jonathan saying it's time to perhaps take up the radicalness of our ancestors. Yes, Ashe. That in, I also want to speak to the indigeneity that was spoken to, because one of the things that I hope we develop in our culture, and that I think BBSH for me has always been wanting to point to that, point us to our authentic nature, point us to essence, help to develop that. Even within the construct, it was pretty structured when I went there as a student, and I was really structured. But it's, you know, keeps changing, it keeps evolving. And is to keep feeling within yourself the points of, again, this word initiation keeps coming to me, the points of initiation that we go through in allowing our indigeneity to come alive, to become activated. We all have that. There are points in time I've come to notice that we go through initiations in our life. The first one actually begins at age 9. At age 9 years old, you begin to experience, and Haudenosaunee, who is a Dagran shaman, speaks to this. At 9 years old, you begin to feel stirrings of your longing. In the white Western culture, we may act it out in play. But in other cultures, in the community paying attention to what's happening in the child, you can cultivate, you can encourage the purposefulness as it's starting to be shown for the child at that age. We go through many initiations in our lifetime. And each one of those can be seen, celebrated, and anchored through ritual, through ceremony. I'm not talking about the Native American ceremony. I'm talking about a ceremony that we can create as a culture to honor those points of initiation. We don't have that in Western culture. Our tending to initiations are very rote, and they tend to be disconnected from our indigenous nature, their lack embodiment. So we can bring that. And I know that that's one thing from my perspective that that BBSH really encouraged that. And we're at another threshold to move beyond what we've known to be our current reality. I had lots of stories to share, but I think I'm tired. So I want to say I'll say one other thing. I'll share you one of my favorite poems, and it's Hafiz. He says all I want to say, I think. I've come into this world to see this. I've come into this world to see this. The sword drop from men's hands, even at the height of their arc of anger. Because we have finally realized there is just one flesh to wound. I have come into this world to see this, to see all creatures hold hands as we pass through this miraculous existence we share on the way to even greater being of soul, a being of just light and forever entwined in that play. I have come to this world to hear this. Every song the earth has sung since it was conceived in the divine's womb and began spinning from that wish. To hear every song by wing and fin and hoof, every song by hill and fields and tree and woman and man and child, every song of stream and rock, every song of tool and lyre and flute, and every song of gold and emerald and fire. Every song the heart should cry with magnificent dignity to know itself alive. I have come into this world to experience this. Men and women so true that they would rather die before speaking an unkind word. Men and women so true, their lives are their covenant and the promise of hope. I have come into this world to see this. The sword drop from men's hands, even at the height of the arc of rage, because we have finally realized and embodied that there is just one flesh we can wound. Thank you, Patricia. I also just want to say that My name is Sherry Asia Munai Pei, and the name was given to me. Name was given to me by my beloved Nathan. It's from the Anakan word, Asi. It's from my beloved Israeli family. Munai is a Quechuan from my Peruvian shaman friend. And Sherry and Pei, it's from my mother and father. So. It's just so nice to see some of you I haven't seen for so long.
We've come to the end of another Tuesday. Thank you, Sherry. And thank you to all the presenters. Thank you to all of you who have come again and again, and who might be joining us for the first time. Thank you, Ada. Thank you, Haruna. Thank you, Lisa. And all the faculty who show up week after week after week, and also at the debriefs, which used to be an hour, and now they're almost 4. Thank you, Ladine. Next week's our last week. Week 7, we're gonna make sure that we're gonna change the world, okay? We're gonna change the world on week 7. Radical transformation. Good night.
Patricia.
Yeah. I can't hear you so good.
Can I stay on with you? I have something to add.
Okay.
With you.
Thank you, Patricia, for your vision and for holding space. Thank you.
Thank you, Haruna.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Julie.
I love you so much. All of you. Thank you. Love you.
Thank you. Love you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Shay.
Thank you to all of you, every one of you.
Thank you, Eva. It's really good to see you.
It's so good to see you too. Brought a smile to my face.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for trusting.
This is my grandbaby, great grandbaby.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, that's because you want to know who all these people. They are people I know. Okay.
Ada, my grandbaby, is 24.
Oh wow! Well, this is a great grandbaby. I got some great grandbabies.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Yes. So they've been really good while I'm in here. So now I'm going and enjoy them.
Enjoy. I'm taking Nathan to dinner.
Oh wow. Good. Enjoy.
It's his birthday.
Take care. Happy birthday, Nathan.
Yeah. Birthday. Mm.
Thanks so much for this sharing and this community.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Hard to let go.
Hi, Lisa.
Bye, everybody.
Hi, Haruna.
Haruna. Okay. Love you all so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Going to eat some lunch now. So hungry.
Love you.